Hello, everybody, and welcome to another of Cohere's podcast from the Are We All Listening series. Today, I'm very happy and grateful to be joined by Ishimwe, Jean Marie Ishimwe, who I've known for many years, just like all the people we've interviewed so far, which has made it enjoyable because we've been able to go back down memory lane, and I'm sure today will be no different. I won't try to introduce Ishimwe and all of his different bits of work that he's been doing in the last 5 or 10 years, because that's going to be my first question. Just after saying thank you for coming, Ishimwe, and perhaps actually before we get into what you're doing now, you could tell us a little bit about your background and just tell us a bit about yourself and how you've got to where you are today.
Yes, thank you, Ed. Thank you for having me on this podcast. I think I should say that from where you've started, just that we've come down what I would describe a long journey of knowing each other. Way back from when I was still in school, struggling to get very basic things like school fees for my education. But also over time in the work within this space of supporting refugees and refugee-led organization. Maybe I should start from the fact that I am a refugee here in Kenya, having been in this country for over 20 years. Over time, I think you grow into a life where there's so much you want to do, but also so much that you're restricted as a refugee. Of course, of the many reasons that for maybe most of the listeners are aware of about the challenges that refugees face. But Ed, I think from the long time we've known each other, I think with the work that I've been doing in Kenya, especially around advocacy, I got so much inspiration for just the work that I did before, even at Savior Project after high school. But later on, when I was just supporting refugees and with the youth refugees that we were working together at Youth Voices community, I think it showed us so much that for a long time, we were in a system that we kept on complaining about the challenges, but it was not allowing us to actually be able to provide some solutions for those challenges. And establishing YVC with the colleagues there really then brought up for us, I think, and for me particularly, this element of refugee agency and being able to support. And to be honest, for a long time, the landscape and the refugee landscape in Kenya was always, and I think in many other contexts, has been more of refugees taking and benefiting from a system, actually, in real sense, not benefiting per se, but trapped in a system that's not working. And so it can look like you're benefiting, but you're not. And so for me and for the colleagues at YVC, building that organizations to do advocacy was very instrumental. I mean, the work that Cohere and the support to me, actually, especially as well for my last part of my high school, was instrumental in showing me that indeed the loss was not there was still some hope, and this is the work that I continue to do until today.
Thanks. And we'll definitely come back to your work in advocacy and refugee agency. But first, this is a one-off opportunity for Cohere to brag about our connections to you. And so let's just go back a bit in history. You mentioned there that you first got to know us in your last year of secondary school, which was because we Cohere, who were previously at that time called Xavier Project, had a new partnership where we took on the sponsorship of secondary school fees that was supported in urban areas of Kenya. And you happened to be in your last year when we took on that contract. And then we had we had an idea at the time to try to recruit as many of the graduates who are finishing what is known as Form 4, or the end of secondary school in Kenya, to join our team at Zebra Project Cohere, in whichever way we could make it work. What do you remember about that process? Because I remember interviewing you for that job. But what's your memories of transitioning from Zebra Project as a student to eventually joining us? Well, not eventually, but very quickly joining us as a full-time team member.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have the luxury of time to be able to say all, all my experience in that time, but I think first to say that to this date, I think I still have and hold with so much regard that support that you gave me towards my last part of my education. To be honest, throughout all my high school and pretty much all my primary school, I've always struggled with school fees. My family is not from a well-off family, of course. Being refugees in the circumstance that we find ourselves, it was very difficult for my family to be able to support at least that time four siblings. And I think I've never said this before, but I before coming to Cohere this time, I had visited, I think, at least three organizations. All of them told me that they were not going to be able to support me because their priorities of what they were supporting was something else. And then I felt frustrated until I came and we met, and you were able to support me in that period. But beyond that, I think for me was the transition into Tamuka Hub, and really the experience for me that time, um, after the interviews and taking that role, was, to be honest, an experience of continuous learning, but even more so a process that I greatly appreciate today because it made me realize that there was much more beyond being a refugee. The opportunity to be a trainer and to, of course, train refugees, fellow refugees, was something that made me both understand the not only the challenges that I was facing as a refugee myself, and the value in terms of teaching digital literacy to the group, but also understanding the other various challenges that we were actually similar with some of the issues. So issues around documentation, issues around access to opportunities, access to all these things are issues that really were some things that was connected. But I think the most important part of that whole process, and I would say, and I think maybe you'd agree with me, is that I think I pretty much um, took the role of leading that whole center. I mean, for just straight from high school to teaching and growing that trainer position, and then to overall being able to coordinate that whole space and see that it was active and people are coming and finding value in that place, I think molded me as a leader just to be able to take a responsibility. I think I was able to look at problems. I was able to look at the challenges that the center was facing, but also other refugees, and taking that heart of big responsibility with with my less age at that time, but also maybe not so much experience, really helped me grow as a leader and as a responsible person in that process. And I think it is with that first step that you supported us, and not just me, but a number of those other graduates from high school who Korea was supporting then, that I think has propelled us to today. I think we don't get this opportunity, and not being uh, in some ways saying that maybe there's not going to be another way, but I think that early exposure into the refugee professional kind of humanitarian work, but more or less the age the I mean, I think the whole idea, even the way Tamuka Hub was molded into supporting refugees, and then they support themselves in the end, or maybe take up the role, was something that for me I think stood out very early on. That I started to think about myself as a solution enabler, but also as someone that I can look beyond the challenges that I'm facing and look beyond to see, okay, what could be my role in that process? And I think that whole process was impactful till today for me.
Yeah, and speaking of leadership, I mean, no, I appreciate you saying all those things. We felt very privileged to have your cohort joining our team, and we had a few fantastic years with the Tamuka hubs, which were effectively like community centers that we were running as Cohere, and we realized quite early on that the best format for these community centers was actually to hand over ownership 100% to the local community, even in terms of the branding and the way that they were run, and funding, everything being independent really of Cohere, um, which was a gradual transition. And you must have seen that trend very early on, because by the time we were ready to hand over one of the Tamuka hubs in Nairobi, Youth Voices community that you founded was already in existence, and we soon handed over one of the spaces completely to YVC. And that was only one of the many activities that YVC did while you were leading the organization. And it was an interesting experience for us to go into our third um, element of our relationship with you, from first being a student of the organization, secondly being a colleague, and then being a partner. We even went into some consortiums together in a shared consortium during COVID, among quite a few other funding things that we did. Sometimes it was Cohere funding YBC, but there were a few examples of where we did projects in an more equitable, shared way, although it wasn't perfect. Um, but I think to leapfrog into the almost the fourth dimension of our relationship, because we could talk about YBC for a long time as well if we wanted. But you then stepped into another space again. I think this was another example of you seeing trends and seeing a massive gap, just as you had around the time you founded YBC, was that you wanted to step into that space outside even of the RLO, of a traditional RLO structure, um, supporting the ecosystem more broadly for refugee leadership, supporting systems change, advocacy at all the highest levels, as well as the local level, through your work at RSeed. Um, could you tell us a bit about your role at RSeed, and what are the main things that you do within, what are you working on in 2025, for example?
Yeah. No, I mean, thanks, Ed, for that question, and also just to go back to what you've mentioned right now about the of course the what you'd call the life journey of that time. Since the time you can see the various changes in my life, but also now it becomes our lives because we are interacting and we are growing in different ways. But I think the most important part to say is, I think that that kind of transition within that period, I mean, came on just as asking for support, and then became a sponsored student for Xavier, and then later on a trainer and leading Tamuka Hub, and then later on being a partner. I think was a to be honest, I think this is what any graduate youth would want to have an experience where, not to say that the carpet is rolled out for you to because of course it was not an easy journey, but being able to move from one stage to the other, and growing within that process is important. I think there are certainly various challenges that all had in itself that time, and I think for me it is those that realization within that process that there could be systemic challenges that we are not able to resolve, and we need to broaden the advocacy and so on and so forth. I mean, if I remember in terms of the challenges within Kenya with payment for refugees or hiring refugees, and I think Cohere starting this was a very important first step. I think over time, really, that advocacy towards better resourcing and better, I mean, that example of supporting refugees in terms of hiring and paying them well also was a very fast gateway to start this discussion as well. I think in terms of my so I think the way advocacy, and I think for me, I see it, it's about systemic change. It's about issues that communities face continuously that both frustrate them but also anger them. But at the same time, does not allow them to actually lead and craft the future that they want. And this is the exactly situation that, as a person myself, but as the refugee community in Kenya, but broadly within East Africa and Africa, I continue to feel that I felt that there was need to broaden advocacy, really, from a perspective of we cannot have very skillful, experienced people, refugees in this case, coming from their countries of origin, and they're only reduced to mere beneficiaries and mere just people who are trapped in a situation that they cannot help themselves, in real sense, because the system is not working. And so early on, I think, while at YVC, while at in various of those spaces, I think we started advocating for a much more better system that listens to refugees. Of course, we were youth, and at YVC, certainly most of us being refugee youths, we were pushing for youth, and but then that, outgrew itself from just youth, but just the space within refugees. So looking at the systemic challenges of documentation in Kenya, but then broadly as well. And for me, I think the opportunities I got this time to go and advocate for things like socioeconomic inclusion in various spaces globally, at the GRF, or even at I mean, most of the works that we were doing um, with some education team at UNHCR, advocating for greater access for education, for transition for education. I think this, like local challenges and refugee challenges, contextually from the country, from here, for example, helped me so much to push that advocacy globally there. That how do we get more people to listen to the challenges that refugees are facing, but actually not just listening, that things are not working, and how do we change that? And I remember the one thing that separated me, and I'll not say per se with everyone else, is the fact that I was leading an organization. So every time I was going there, I was still, as an institution, as YVC, and coming from East Africa, I was pursuing more of this systemic restructuring within inclusion, at national level. So how do refugees get included, and so on and so forth. And I think that is the work that then propelled me over time, in the work that I was doing both at YVC consultancy with various organizations, within Kenya and East Africa, around the very many issues that I am very passionate about. I mean, economic inclusion, um, leadership and agency for refugees, supporting local actors, supporting policy change, really are the things that I think, propelled me further to engage at the level where I'm engaging. So at this point, from being a refugee with nothing, from working at the community level, working with, being a student, being a sponsored student at Cohere, and then later on, with being a partner at YVC, I think all that experience is what I've accumulated as a person, but I always not see myself as a one person. I think I see myself as as a block of, not to say that I represent all refugees, but I think that kind of institution, that what could change if the refugee, of a refugee, of or if a refugee is actually redefined from the usual aspects of definition. I mean, of course, we know this and they're important from a protection point of view, but I think in terms of long-term sustainable development of people, I think the people-centeredness and allowing people that are most affected and those that are intended to be supported by programs to actually lead is a very big priority, not just for me, but even in the continent in supporting ourselves and Africans to build a future for themselves. And so I work at RCIT as the East Africa regional lead, mainly managing our two main portfolios, which is Kenya or states, Kenya and Uganda, in institutionalizing refugee participation at a national level, at the state level. What this means in contextualization really is that we support countries to build what we call refugee advisory mechanisms, which are expert based type of refugee leadership ecosystem where government or we help to support governments to model a mechanism that engages refugees as technical experts but also as advisors. We have seen in a long time, and we're not conflicting in terms of the various types of participation. I think this is important to note that there's various ways of looking at how to support participation. But for us, I think it's that level of support to refugees to engage with bureaucrats, with governments, systemically as institution at that level to relook at policies and create a global refugee ecosystem that systemically addresses effectiveness of responses, but also putting refugees at the center of influencing those decisions. And so we always see this more of a sustained way of refugees from a diverse background with their expertise being able to influence decisions, be part of the various decision making processes, and especially at the state level in driving that change we want. I'll say just two things, maybe. First, this is the main work that we are doing. So, under our we have three main angles of our work, or the body of our work. So, they engage, amplify, and connect work. Engage is almost like 70% of the work we do, which is engaging with various states. Our work is really towards the states, but also with working with the other stakeholders. What we have done is that through our partnership with the local engagement research network based at Carleton Universities, that we did an evidence research showing how we could institutionalize refugee participation at state level. And we looked at 20 states, 10 from hosting countries and 10 from the donor countries. And the idea is that if we're able to build refugee advisory mechanisms, 10 from the host countries and 10 from the donor countries, then we are likely to be able to build a blueprint of how to normalize and create an emerging a normalization of that particular process. And we've been very successful in the global north, and now moving into the global south, where there's a little bit more politics of the issues within refugee issues, the challenges to that, host and refugees politics as well. I think that's where the crux of the matters are, but really is supporting the institutionalization of refugees at the state level. The two part of that then goes is that we support a transparent process. So around 12, 7 to 12 refugees would be then selected by an independent body, and then they're able to go and select, then they're able to be selected to be part of state delegation. So in drill, like the Kenyan delegation would go with a refugee as an advisor or a technical, and they engage sustainably within that process. But then the advisory body is able to work by itself. And then two, we are offering support to that. So we give initial funding to that body, but also over time we advocate for the countries to support these bodies. And then we do trainings for that global advocacy within Geneva. So our work beyond that is really looking at a system that not only listens to refugees and provides them the space, but actually engages with them as partners, but actually in more depth from a expertise position to see how the challenges within policy and within the global refugee regime is changed with the refugees at the table.
Wow. So when you talk about system change, I mean, most people, when talking about the system, when they think of humanitarian aid, think of the international humanitarian sector, but actually you're going out even outside of that to a broader system at the geopolitical level. Um, it's it's really some of what you're talking about is political influence, political power that I fully agree. Refugees should, in virtually every country around the world, have their rights suppressed when it comes to their political rights. So what you're doing is making a start in elevating those rights and their sort of their political voice in the countries that are hosting them and the regions that are hosting them. Um,
Yeah,
mm,
yeah, and certainly not that they get elected or anything like that, but then from an influence position systemically, that's the only way. I mean, we know the role of states, we know the role of states not only just at the national level or regional level, but actually also at the international level. So yeah, certainly, I think when you think about the rights of people, the right, the challenges is faced systemically, I think it goes back to how much engagement and participation sustainably is provided with them for them, and then crafted at that national and international level, geopolitical also level, i- is very important. I think for us, we've seen over time, being in this space, that unfortunately the global system is crafted in a way that first it's maybe rigid but also difficult sometimes to change the way it operates, and doesn't provide the power to refugees to be part of solution. And so to be able to see that the difference we want systemically to change is that then we have to increase and provide the institutionalization of refugee agency at that level, and working with states and bureaucrats at that level then provides that avenue.
and what are the some of the main barriers you face? I mean, one that I can imagine, having witnessed parallel conversations, even some I've been involved in with you, is this question of representation. You're talking about around 12 people on a panel representing refugee community in that country. And something that often frustrates me is this criticism that those 12 people cannot be representative of hundreds of thousands of people, and that can end up delegitimizing what they're saying, or it's an easy scapegoat for people who don't really want refugees at the table to say, well, that's just someone with a loud voice who doesn't represent the 500,000 people living, refugees living in our country. Um, is this something you come across, and what other similar kind of barriers do you face when trying to advocate for this institutionalization of refugee agency?
I mean, I think one bigger question sometime to ask is that is there one entity that you could say represents everything that is in this world? Like, of course, there are supposed entities that represents this, represent, but can we say that there's only one entity that represents women, or INGOs or NGOs or whatever? I mean, whatever we can think about. And I think the answer is no, unless someone wants to argue that there is. We know UNHCR as this representative body for refugees, but in real sense, we are talking about today about refugee-led organizations representing refugees. So are we saying that they are not? Are we saying they are? And the question is then, how do you contextualize the various roles that everyone plays in that process? Um, for us, that certainly comes out as sometimes a challenge, but we always talk about our model as not per se for representation only, or we cannot stand to argue that the RCIP model is so like this is the representative model for all refugees in Kenya, for example, when Kenya builds it. But it's to say that this is one of those models, especially from the purpose point of view of the work that it does, that it can create an avenue where, or a channel where government is able to engage with the refugees from a technical expertise position. So we could find, and the process that we've been able to build has a process to be able to select various people with their skills um, in a diverse way to be part of that panel. But this is not to say that this is ultimately the representation of all refugees. But we are saying is that there are various complementary avenues of participation, like there's community leaders, there's various refugee engagement forum, for example, in Uganda. These are formats that should continue to be there and should be strengthened and should not be argued in the this idea of one fits all. I think it's a discussion that we have to be of that reality. And so we face that, but it's more of continuing to socialize the idea of this as a participation mechanism that allows what maybe sometimes is difficult for people to see, but really an institutionalized way of bringing refugees with technical expertise at that level. So, and the various people can be included in various processes. So, not excluding per se anyone, but just looking at the purpose of that process. Among other challenges that we find ourselves meeting beyond that representation question, I think, is the question of sustaining that process. One of the challenges that I've had to face, especially within East Africa, is the you know I think I would say it even in this way, like more or less not per se on an accountability position, but more so of the prioritization of this participation. I think we certainly have many other challenges that we are facing within the region. So lack of funding, systemic challenges, and national system issues. I mean, interest for host countries, interest from the governments as well, and so on and so forth. But you find that the issue of refugee participation sometimes, unfortunately, is looked at from a position of just as a good thing to do, but also maybe we can do this when we have the resources. And so it's like a more of a concern. Okay, let's find the resources, and when we can, we're able to support. And I think for us, this is an issue that becomes difficult to engage on when we are seeing it being detached to the actual effectiveness of those responses and programs. So being able to make governments, various partners to understand and to put this to is one of these things. And then two is the perception within the region. So I think there's a level of expectation of to which level can a refugee engage, and some people argue let them just engage at the community level. Some people argue maybe let them engage just up to a certain level. But what we are saying is that it is it is hurtful to not see the opportunity that refugees with their skills, refugee-led organizations with their experiences, with the kind of ideas they have, not engaging in all possible areas, but even more at national and high level. So to say that then if you're able to work with refugees from that recognition point of view at a national level, but beyond just at where they are, then there's a greater essence to looking at a different angle of solving the challenges refugees face, which for some of the hosting countries we've struggled for some of these issues for over 30 years. So what is the opportunity to look at the refugees with their lived experience, with their technical expertise, with the skills that they have from back of their country, with the ideas they have, to rethink their contribution beyond just being given or taking something. And I think the system needs to appreciate that this is the kind of discussion we need to have in providing that agency, and not to see it as something to scare the people. I mean, it's a reality that the communities today know much more. The information that we have at this time of age is much more. The technology we have right now is much more accessible by many people. So it would be it would be not good to not provide the space for them to lead that process. And I think this is the kind of, yeah. So there are various challenges. There are many challenges beyond that, funding and so on and so forth. I mean, but we take each as much as we can.
I mean, it seems crazy that you have a system where an entire nation's politics can be designed so that refugees get no political voice, no actual platform to to air their views in a constitutional sense. And when it's proposed that just a small number have a voice, even though they have no formal political sway, then it's still deprioritized and put on the back burner until the funds are there, and that all these other criticisms will come in around those refugee voices at the table are not representative of the community as a whole, even though at that same table there could be INGOs and sometimes multiple INGOs who just get their seat there by virtue of having that job, even though they're not often nationals of the country in question at all. And there'll also be a lot of civil servants, I would imagine, who are just employees rather than elected officials, who also have quite a lot of power and say in those decisions. And the way the status quo and the assumptions that we all seem to have, because it seems to be pretty much a universal thing. I mean, you say you're making progress in the 10 countries in the global north, which is great to hear, but it's pretty much universal that as soon as you become a refugee, then your political rights are suppressed. But I like the angle you're taking by saying, well, let's even go outside of the national system and bring refugee voices into international dialogue, where actually there can be less formal structures of legitimacy based on some kind of democratic votes. And you do need people to be diplomatic and come together to find solutions. And almost by definition, international forced displacement is an international issue. I mean, refugees who are cross borders, that is already an international issue. So maybe it makes a lot of sense to leapfrog the national level politics but I sort of wonder whether, given the challenges you've mentioned when trying to bring refugee voices into national level discussions, will it always be tokenistic unless refugee communities have more agency and more power outside of just being at the table? Do you see what I mean? Like if for example, refugees have no freedom of movement and no right to work, and struggle therefore to really contribute in a meaningful way to the local economy and have that leverage or the assets to negotiate with, will it always just be a sort of tokenistic invitation to say, okay, come to the table, but ultimately we're going to make decisions on your behalf? That's one of my, I guess, fears, or and why I sometimes feel that we could be spending a lot of money trying to, and it's not just at the national level. We've seen. I wonder what your opinion is on this. All the huge efforts we go to fly to enable refugee leaders to fly to Geneva for the big meetings, as if it's the numbers that are there that's important, as opposed to really what they can say and achieve in those meetings to promote the agenda of their own community. If the system is structured to not actually listen to them and not have any incentive to listen to them, then how will it go beyond the tokenistic that they're actually there?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you rightly said it. I think, to be honest, I think someone said, and I think there's a book for it, that you cannot use the master's tools to dismantle him or the master. And I think this is, for me, what I've seen from the power that refugee-led organizations have been able to prove over time. I mean, if it's not to be at very diplomatic, I think the system has built, and not mention names, but the system has built a space where refugees are systemically made to depend on certain things, and that really deprives their power and ideas and how they need to think. Because I think the beyond being provided with a space, beyond being provided with the agency, and then so long as you have to negotiate and prove why you're important, then it means that there's actually a bigger surgery that needs to happen systemically to be able to see that difference on the role of communities and role of refugees. But I think it goes, um, without fast going into the system part of it. I think it goes into the way the system has really crippled the mindset of communities, that we know that communities and refugees have the power to change their lives, but the system has made it sure that dependency and always thinking that this is the only place to find the solution is the only way. But I think the RLOs have built their own movement, built their own ways of, really institutionalizing, coming and saying that we as an entity are providing, and we've been invisible for a long time, and we are doing all this work. I mean, our city is also an international refugee organization initiative, and we've been able to build what the organization has built all this time, in essence, being able to have all these various discussions at that level. But I think it is first important to realize that while there's a lot of, and I think we did an assessment of this, that there was increase in the number of refugees that came to GRF from, I think, if I can remember correctly, I think 72 in 2019 and 324 in 2023. I think first, I'd say it's important to acknowledge that, because access to these spaces is fundamentally uh, not available for most refugees. But I think beyond that is going to what's the impact of of those engagements, and I think, to be honest, sometimes it's the power that is still held with the big powers within the system that does not and needs to be pushed more to actually share that power. Because I think we would find ourselves in a very tricky position where we only have either one refugee or two refugees, or only 10 refugees going to, by lack of a good word, just advocating or fighting from a system that has 10,000 people who are not of refugee, but they really are doing just their job vis-a-vis a refugee. And I think the numbers has as a meaning, but I think it's going beyond that. It's really what's the impact, and how can we change the system to allow refugees being at the table becomes more of an influential position of, not because you are not just selected to come and just share your story. You're being selected because of the skills you have. And we've seen this, and this is where I think I also appreciate the work we're doing, is because we tell governments and the various donors that, for example, Jean Marie doesn't know anything about AI. What, for heaven's sake, is the reason of taking him to AI, for example, to speak on an AI issue? And so having a refugee that has some of those very specific skills, and allows for a much more better also sustained way of engaging, because then that can, and I think there's challenges to that. Really, there's challenges because it will have to go back to how do you sustain that engagement. But I think we risk more not having refugees than having them there. So I think it's really thinking about what and how to change that system. I also wanted to say that I think, um, and I said this in another forum, based on also some of the things that I've also gained over time. If change is not happening at the community level, then it's not happening anywhere. I'll say that again. If change is not happening in the community, it is not happening anywhere. Any refugee advocate is going to the global space, and of course at the UN level, advocating for communities, and we are not seeing significant change within that community. I think it's a rethinking of what is that engagement looking like, and it's not the mistake of Ishimo or that refugee advocate. It's just the problem is the system, and that needs to be changed. But you realize that the frustration that goes back much more is what the community feels. So people are not getting better education, they're not getting more opportunities for education, they're not getting included in the national system, they're not provided the space to, work towards the how much they need to build their own solutions, and in supporting the initiative. I think becomes an issue that many refugee advocates face and RLOs face, that you went to this space, advocated, and many people think that things will happen overnight. I think we need to still push for kind of very, not quick per se, but actionable and ways that we see change happening, even though it takes longer. But I think this is the frustration we get. It will not be a one day, 1 month, 1 year thing that we get people into these spaces and change will happen. But I think the most important part of it is how do we build a refugee leadership ecosystem that provides the resources, the influence, the space, and the recognition that refugee organizations and refugees need to solve the issues that they face every day.
Yeah, and it's a catch-22 because to have that influence and to have that genuine leverage that you bring, there are some key rights and barriers, key barriers that need to be reduced. For example, in Kenya, if refugees had real freedom of movement and real freedom to work, and had done for the last 35 years, we can only imagine what the between 500,000 to 1 million refugees that have been in the country at any one time would have done, how they would have been able to stabilize. And if by now in other countries around the world, they'd be citizens of Kenya, they'd be paying taxes even more than they are, they'd be creating businesses and many other things. And then rights then flow from that. I mean, as an example, some of them would be citizens, and then they would have far more rights. But that's not something that has been enabled in Kenya, is through this perpetuation of a dependency, a system of dependency for refugees, particularly in Kakuma and Dadaab. But maybe just to point the spotlight back at the international community, my theory, maybe a conspiracy theory, but something I believe, is that without the influence of international community over the last 35 years in Kenya, refugees would have freedom of movement and freedom to work. In other words, if there was no aid system coming in and effectively propping up what I think is a political tool of sustaining the refugee camps, the refugee camps wouldn't even be there, and we wouldn't have this question, even this whole thing of the Sharika plan, this new plan to enable more progressive policies for refugees in Kenya, wouldn't be needed in 2025. Something like that would have happened in 1991, because I don't see the incentive for the Kenyan government sustaining 2 massive refugee camps for 35 years without the international aid system. And so, what are your thoughts about the different targets of advocacy? I mean, sometimes it can be easy to just point a finger at a national policy, but then we also need to unpack what's behind it and why a policy like that has been sustained in such a protracted sense with no real benefit that I can see, certainly not to refugees.
Yes, certainly. I think this is why and I think at least for activists, refugee advocates, RLO allies, um, I think keep advocating for the decolonization of aid at that level. Not to say really from a perspective of just localizing aid, but I think the way aid has been made to make states refugees to be dependent is from, if we were to look deeply, is from an interest. What are the interests that everyone is trying to push? And just as you've said, I think, why would there be a system that makes people to be virtually excluded from contributing to a country for over 30 years, yet there's billions, millions, or if not billions of money being used over time? And I think this is, for me, the frustration of the system. What can we say from the funding that has come to refugee programs has actually made impact? Yes, there's quite a lot of that UNHCR and the various partners have supported to see refugees be resettled, refugees access education, and so on and so forth. But to what fraction of that is actually changing the system for the better for refugees? And I think this is the rethinking of the international community that needs to happen. And rightly, as you said, I think by now there are over 800,000 refugees who, for most people, actually, for most of the research done recently on on the host communities' attitudes toward refugees, shows that most host communities don't have an issue with refugees. But why is it that every time there's a program, like right now with the Shirika plan, of course, there are host communities that feel that they need to know exactly what kind of benefits they're getting from that. And I'm being very honest as that, because I think it is various um, levels of what is everyone benefiting. But most important, I think the question we have to be going back to is, what are the communities benefiting from? So the host communities, the refugee communities. And to be honest, a benefit for refugees and the host community is a benefit to the state and benefit to the entire system. But this somehow is not looked at that level, because if refugees are able to be self-reliant, in actual sense, have a work permit, access good jobs, and also and so on and so forth, freely move from one place to the other, then the aid system does not have to struggle with funding, getting money to always fund programs that are not sustaining, and so on and so forth. So it's all beneficial, but I think it is, for me, this is the moment, and I think I made this comment at a podcast with the New Humanitarian about letting refugees lead. But even for other ways, you'd think about this as the new, you know, positive revolution to make the system actually work. And for a long time, refugees have been described from a perspective, to me, really ridiculously as it is, to be beneficially over time. I think it's not a proper way to put it. And I think that's a realization we need to move towards in looking at how the system has been failing over time, or has contributed to that dependency, that it really does not support innovation and inclusion in a much more real, genuine way. And the sooner we start having those discussions more faster and clearly and very open and honestly, not because you're against two or so on, but to see how we benefit the system, then we are going to be reaching to that level. I think it will take us a few years. It will take us, I think, next couple of years, with the funding landscape changing. It provides us that opportunity to think about the refugees in the RLOs. But I think to look at the international community, it's a very good representation of how systems work and systems do not work. And I think the aspect to what is not working is because for many programs designed for communities and refugees, over time have not been engaging refugees to a great extent in making them as partners. So over time, just as beneficiaries or feedback, just the last moment. And so that is the new thinking we need to have. And the international community has to see this, and especially organizations have to see this not from a competition or from a fear or uncertain fear of that maybe these people. I mean, in real sense, if people are able to take control of how their future looks like, the better even. But if that fear is what you have, I think for me, then you might be doing the wrong job. You might really not be. You might actually be uh, propagating and making the system be as it is. And so I think it's gonna take a lot of rethinking. But I think the sooner we do that, with the funding landscape changing and with everyone, I think this is the moment to look at where do all our roles align, both the UNHCR, the organizations, partners, states, and then what is the role that can be strengthened of refugees and refugee leaders to be part and parcel as an equal partner in that process. And I think that's the discussion that we have to do. But allow me to say as well that I think we always talk about um, Africa solutions by Africans, and this is the same message we are continuing to push. I think refugee challenges need refugee solutions. We have or forced displaced people. We have over 120 now refugees across the world. I think I look at this as a solution. As I don't just look at the burden, but I look at the solutions that these people could be having. And maybe just take not even all that 100 something million, but take even 50 million or even 20 million. How much solution could come if people are provided the agency to lead, the agency to transform their communities as partners and not as the usual quote unquote just benefit, or you're a small community and so you don't deserve the voice, you don't deserve to be taking part in that process. And I think, and perhaps this is the work that Kohi and the many other organizations, maybe perhaps I would ask you as well, how do we actually change that from a perspective of an organization like you as the one that you're leading, that is already part of this fire, quote unquote, that we know why it's important, but we're still failing. And I think that's the question you need to ask. And I would love to hear what you think about. I mean, I think, in my opinion, has to be also mentally, but also, I mean, the mindset has to change from that level. We have beyond mindset, we have to put the resources and provide the power to refugees and share that together, recognize them, fund them, because 1% of our humanitarian funding is coming to local organization, even smaller for RLOs. But I think for the chance we have is maybe states, partners, UNHCR, and the bigger and the other organizations that are already inclined into this discussion on how do we actually propel together this and then what moment do we have to seize for that?
Yeah, I mean the international community, especially the international refugee response, is obsessed with the idea of protection. Protection is the word that always has to come right at the top. But by holding on to power and holding on to decision making, what's really happening is they're protecting them from a problem that they are themselves creating by not letting go and switching that focus from protection to agency, because through agency, the 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 actual problem that refugee communities need to be protected from no longer exists, or certainly doesn't exist in the same way. And 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 yeah, we could talk for a long time about what could be some of the steps, and you've talked about it a lot today, and I absolutely agree that. And I'm encouraged and inspired as well by the work that you're doing at that international level, because I think it is we need multi-pronged approaches to these kind of questions, and you seem to be in the right seat to be the ones leading that and spearheading that. So although it's not my area of expertise by any means, and I don't understand it, so I don't even understand how it's done. So it's been fascinating to learn a bit from you today about that process and the successes that you're already having. So I wish you all the best with that. And I think just by asking that question at the end there, you've set us up well for a second podcast, because through your experience as a refugee leader, a refugee-led organization, that's where our work of our bread and butter overlaps a bit more. And there could be so many fascinating things we could discuss about the role of refugee-led organizations and refugee leadership at the community level, of which you're also an expert. So let's look forward to that. And for now, just to say thank you, Ishimwe, for joining us today, and thank you everyone else for listening in.
Thank you.